July 30th, 1945, 12:14 a.m., Philippine Sea. The USS Indianapolis was steaming alone through dark waters, making 17 knots toward Leyte Gulf. The heavy cruiser had just completed one of the most secret missions of World War II, delivering components of the atomic bomb that would soon be dropped on Hiroshima to Tinian Island. The mission was complete. The cargo had been safely delivered. The ship was heading to rejoin the fleet at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, where she would participate in training exercises before what everyone expected would be the final invasion of Japan. In a few weeks, the war would be over, though no one aboard the Indianapolis knew that the weapon they had just delivered would make that invasion unnecessary. Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III stood on the bridge, reviewing routine reports from the evening watch. McVeigh was an experienced naval officer from a distinguished Navy family. His father had been an admiral, and McVeigh himself had commanded the Indianapolis since November 1944. He had brought the ship through several major operations in the Pacific, including the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where the cruiser had provided gunfire support for the invasions. The ship had been hit by a kamikaze aircraft off Okinawa, suffering significant damage that required repairs at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California. It was during those repairs that the Indianapolis had been selected for the secret mission to deliver atomic bomb components. The night was moonless, with scattered clouds obscuring what little starlight might have provided visibility. The sea was calm, with only gentle swells rolling across the surface. Visibility was moderate, not excellent, but not poor enough to require special precautions according to the intelligence briefings McVeigh had received. Below decks, most of the 1,196 sailors and Marines aboard were sleeping in their bunks or relaxing in the last hours before midnight. Some were writing letters home that they hoped to mail when they reached Leyte Gulf, others were playing cards in the mess areas or reading books and magazines in their berthing spaces. A few were on watch, engine room personnel monitoring the machinery that drove the ship, lookouts scanning the dark horizon, and the bridge crew managing the ship's course and speed. The Indianapolis was traveling alone, which was not unusual for a heavy cruiser late in the war. The Japanese Navy had been largely destroyed, with few surface vessels remaining that posed a threat to American warships. Submarine activity had decreased as American anti-submarine warfare became more effective, and as Japanese submarines were sunk or forced to remain in port. The route from Tinian to Leyte Gulf was considered relatively safe, passing through waters that American forces controlled. There had been no recent submarine contacts reported in the area, and intelligence assessments suggested the Indianapolis could travel without escort. The ship was not traveling in a zigzag pattern, the evasive maneuver designed to make it harder for submarines to target vessels with torpedoes. Zigzagging required constantly changing course in a random or pre-planned pattern, making it difficult for a submarine to calculate a firing solution that would intercept the target. But zigzagging also reduced speed and consumed more fuel, and it required constant attention from the bridge crew. McVeigh had been told during his briefing that zigzagging was optional in conditions of good visibility and when submarine threat was low. Given the intelligence assessments and the moderate visibility, McVeigh had decided not to zigzag. The Indianapolis steamed on a steady course at a steady speed, making best time toward her destination. What Captain McVeigh and his crew did not know was that intelligence was wrong. There was a Japanese submarine in the area, not just in the general region, but directly in the Indianapolis's path, and that submarine was hunting. Japanese submarine I-58, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Mokitsura Hashimoto, was prowling the waters between Guam and Leyte Gulf. The I-58 was a large ocean-going submarine Type B, armed with torpedoes and carrying Chiton, manned suicide torpedoes that were essentially underwater kamikaze weapons. Hashimoto had been on patrol for weeks with little success. The final months of the war had been frustrating for Japanese submariners. American air and surface patrols were intensive, targets were scarce, and the submarines that ventured out often did not return. Hashimoto had been having an unsuccessful patrol, finding few targets in the final weeks of the war. Japanese submarines were no longer receiving the quality of intelligence they once had, and American shipping was increasingly concentrated in protected convoy routes or traveling too fast for submarines to intercept. The I-58 had been cruising the Philippine Sea hoping to encounter targets of opportunity, but had found nothing. Hashimoto was beginning to consider whether to expend his chiton on a low-value target or whether to return to base without having achieved anything significant on this patrol. On the night of July 29-30, Hashimoto was cruising on the surface, using the cover of darkness to recharge the submarine's batteries and to search for targets with better visibility than could be achieved while submerged. The submarine's diesel engines drove generators that recharged the massive banks of batteries that powered the electric motors used for underwater propulsion. Surface running also allowed the use of the conning tower and bridge for observation, giving lookouts better visibility than the periscope could provide when submerged. At approximately midnight, lookouts on the I-58 spotted something on the dark horizon. At first it was just a darker shape against the night sky, possibly a cloud, possibly a ship, hard to tell at distance in the darkness. Hashimoto was called to the bridge and trained his binoculars on the contact. As he watched, the shape resolved into something more definite. It was a ship, a large ship based on its silhouette, and it appeared to be traveling alone. At first Hashimoto could not believe his luck. Throughout weeks of frustrating patrol with no significant targets, suddenly there was a large American warship on the horizon, traveling alone in waters far from any support. As he watched, Hashimoto realized the target was not zigzagging, it was maintaining a steady course and speed. This was almost too good to be true. A large warship, alone, not taking evasive action, presenting itself as a perfect target. Hashimoto's training and experience immediately kicked in. He ordered his submarine to dive, understanding that attacking from the surface would make the I-58 visible and vulnerable to counterattack. As the submarine slipped beneath the surface, Hashimoto moved to the attack periscope in the conning tower and began calculating a firing solution. The target ship was approaching on a steady course. Based on its size and silhouette, Hashimoto identified it as a heavy cruiser, a significant target, exactly the kind of ship Japanese submarines were supposed to sink. The attack required careful calculation. Torpedoes did not travel instantaneously. They required time to cover the distance from submarine to target. During that time, the target ship would continue moving. A successful attack required predicting where the target would be when the torpedoes arrived, not where it was when they were launched. This required knowing the target's course, speed, and distance, then calculating the correct firing angle and torpedo spread that would result in hits. The Indianapolis was making it easy. The steady course and constant speed meant Hashimoto could calculate a firing solution with confidence. If the cruiser had been zigzagging, the calculations would have been much more difficult. The constantly changing course would make it hard to predict where the ship would be when torpedoes arrived. But the Indianapolis obligingly maintained its course, unknowingly presenting itself as a textbook target. Hashimoto positioned his submarine to attack, maneuvering to get into optimal position. The I-58 was equipped with 6 forward torpedo tubes, and Hashimoto intended to use them. At this range and with such a perfect target, multiple hits were likely. At 12:04 a.m. on July 30, 1945, Hashimoto gave the order to fire. 6 Type 95 torpedoes launched from I-58's forward tubes in rapid succession, each propelled by oxygen-fueled engines that left minimal wake and gave little warning to the target. The torpedoes ran true through the dark water toward the unsuspecting Indianapolis. Hashimoto and his crew waited tensely, watching through the periscope, counting seconds, wondering if any would hit. In torpedo attacks, many weapons missed, targets maneuvered, torpedoes malfunctioned, calculations were wrong. But Hashimoto's solution was good, and the Indianapolis was not maneuvering. 2 torpedoes struck the Indianapolis on her starboard side within seconds of each other. The impacts came without warning. No lookout spotted torpedo wakes in the darkness. No alarm sounded. No evasive action was possible. One moment the ship was steaming peacefully through calm seas. The next moment it was torn apart by massive explosions. The first torpedo hit forward, near the bow, striking fuel tanks and igniting aviation gasoline that was stored in compartments near the forward part of the ship. The Indianapolis carried floatplanes for reconnaissance, and aviation gasoline for these aircraft was stored in tanks that were hit directly by the torpedo. The resulting explosion was catastrophic, a massive fireball that erupted from the bowels of the ship, tearing through multiple decks and igniting everything in the forward section of the vessel. The entire bow of the ship was essentially destroyed in the first seconds after impact. The explosion tore through berthing compartments where sailors were sleeping, incinerating men in their bunks. Some died without ever waking, killed instantly by the blast or the fireball that followed. Others woke to find themselves surrounded by flames and collapsing structures with no time to escape before being consumed by fire or crushed by falling debris. The force of the explosion was so great that it lifted the bow of the ship out of the water momentarily before it crashed back down, already beginning to flood through the enormous hole torn in the hull. The second torpedo hit near midship, striking near the communications room, the main fuel bunkers and critical machinery spaces. This explosion was even more devastating than the first. The blast tore open the hull across multiple compartments, creating a massive breach that allowed water to pour into the ship. Engine rooms and boiler rooms were flooded almost instantly, with machinery spaces filling with water and drowning men who were on watch below decks. The explosion destroyed the ship's electrical distribution systems, knocking out all power throughout the vessel and plunging everything into darkness. The loss of electrical power was catastrophic for damage control efforts. Without power, pumps could not operate to fight flooding. Ventilation systems stopped, trapping smoke and toxic gases in compartments throughout the ship. Most critically, the radio equipment was destroyed before any distress signal could be transmitted. The radiomen on duty were killed in the blast, and the radio room itself was destroyed. The ship's internal communication system, the telephones and announcing system that allowed the bridge to communicate with the rest of the ship, failed completely. Officers on the bridge suddenly found themselves unable to communicate with anyone beyond shouting distance. In the chaos and darkness following the explosions, crew members throughout the ship tried to understand what had happened and what they should do. The double impacts had been felt throughout the vessel, a violent shock that threw men from bunks, knocked equipment from mountings and caused anyone standing to lose their footing. In the forward part of the ship, sailors knew immediately something catastrophic had happened. The explosion, the fire, the collapse of structures around them made it obvious. But in the after part of the ship, particularly in compartments deep in the hull, the situation was less clear. Some men thought the ship had hit a mine, an explosive device floating in the water that had detonated against the hull. Others believed they had been hit by a kamikaze aircraft, Japanese suicide planes that had caused so much damage to American ships in recent months. Few immediately recognized that they had been torpedoed, and even fewer understood how catastrophic the damage was. In the darkness, without communications, with conflicting information and rumors spreading, many crew members did not initially realize the ship was sinking. Captain McVeigh was on the bridge when the torpedoes struck. The first explosion threw him across the bridge, slamming him against equipment and momentarily stunning him. Regaining his feet, blood running from cuts on his face, McVeigh immediately began trying to assess the situation and take command of the crisis. He ordered damage reports from all sections of the ship, expecting subordinates to report via sound-powered phones or runners what was happening in their areas. But the sound-powered phone system was not working, either damaged by the blast or inoperative due to circuit breaks. No reports were coming in. McVeigh sent runners sailors dispatched to physically go to different parts of the ship and report back what they found, but the ship was already listing heavily to starboard, making movement difficult and dangerous. Passageways that normally were level were now tilted at steep angles. Water was flooding through some compartments, making them impassable. Darkness made navigation difficult, emergency lighting was not functioning, and the only illumination came from fires or from the few flashlights that crew members carried. The runners who could reach other parts of the ship and return brought horrifying news. The bow was destroyed, completely flooded, with fires raging in the forward sections. The number 1 turret, the forward main gun turret, was damaged and inoperative. Forward berthing compartments were destroyed with an unknown number of casualties. The engine rooms were flooded and power was lost throughout the ship. The list to starboard was increasing steadily as water poured through the damaged hull. Below decks, the situation was apocalyptic. Compartments near the torpedo impacts were simply gone, destroyed by the blasts, with bulkheads blown out, decks collapsed, and structural members twisted into unrecognizable shapes. The men who had been in those compartments at the moment of impact were killed instantly, their bodies incinerated by the explosions or crushed by collapsing structures. In adjacent compartments that had not been directly hit but were damaged, sailors faced desperate situations. Water was pouring in through cracks in bulkheads or through damaged pipes and fittings. In the darkness, men groped their way toward ladders and hatches, trying to reach upper decks before rising water trapped them. Some compartments were sealed by automatic watertight doors that had closed when the explosions occurred, preventing men inside from escaping. Sailors trapped in these spaces pounded on the doors and shouted for help, but in the chaos and darkness their cries were not heard or could not be answered. The most horrifying situations developed in compartments that were flooding but where escape routes were blocked. Sailors found themselves sealed in spaces where water was steadily rising. They climbed to the highest points in the compartments, standing on equipment, on bunks, on anything that kept them above the water level, and waited desperately for rescue that never came. As the water continued rising, they eventually had no more room and were drowned, some within feet of hatches they could not open or could not reach through the flooding water. The Indianapolis was mortally wounded from the moment the torpedoes struck. The damage was simply too extensive, too catastrophic to be controlled with the resources available. The bow was completely flooded and destroyed, multiple compartments amidships were flooded or flooding rapidly. The ship was listing approximately 10 degrees to starboard and getting worse by the minute. The heavy cruiser, displacing nearly 10,000 tons when fully loaded, was taking on thousands of tons of water and slowly rolling over as the weight pulled her down. Engineering officers who managed to reach the bridge and report to Captain McVeigh confirmed what he already suspected: the ship could not be saved. Too many compartments were flooded, the list was increasing, power was gone, and pumps could not function without electricity. Even if power could be restored, the pumping capacity would be inadequate against the volume of water pouring in through the massive holes torn in the hull. The Indianapolis was going down, and nothing could stop it. Captain McVeigh faced the decision that every naval officer dreads and hopes never to make: whether to abandon ship. The traditions and regulations of the Navy emphasized that captains should not abandon their ships lightly. Enormous effort should be made to save the vessel. The captain should be the last to leave, ensuring all crew have been evacuated. But those traditions were written for situations where there was time for organized evacuation, where the ship was stable enough for orderly abandonment, where rescue was nearby or at least possible. The Indianapolis was in none of those situations. The ship was sinking rapidly in the middle of the night, in the middle of the Philippine Sea, hundreds of miles from the nearest land or friendly ship. There was no power, no communications, no way to organize anything. The list was getting worse every minute, and at some point the ship would capsize and sink, taking everyone still aboard down with her. Every minute McVeigh delayed giving the abandoned ship order was a minute when men could have been getting off the ship, increasing their chances of survival. But abandoning ship also meant accepting losses. Men would die in the water from drowning, from exposure, from injuries, from any number of causes. The Navy did not abandon ships and leave crews in the water hundreds of miles from help unless there was absolutely no alternative. McVeigh hesitated, hoping desperately that damage control parties could somehow stabilize the ship, that the flooding could be controlled, that power might be restored and pumps started. But the reports coming back made it clear there was no hope. At approximately 12:15 a.m., just 11 minutes after the torpedo hits, Captain McVeigh gave the order to abandon ship. It was one of the hardest decisions of his life, accepting that his ship was lost and that the best he could do was try to save his crew. But the order, once given, could not be effectively communicated throughout the ship. The PA system that normally would have broadcast the order to every compartment was dead. Sound-powered phones did not work. The only way to pass the order was by word of mouth, shouting it down passageways and into compartments, with each man who heard it passing it along to others. Some sailors near the bridge heard the order directly, and began moving toward life rafts and the side of the ship, but in the after part of the ship, in engineering spaces, in damage control stations deep in the hull, men never received any order at all. They had to make their own decisions about when to leave based on what they could see and feel happening around them: the increasing list, the rising water, the groaning and cracking of the ship's structure as it was torn apart by forces beyond its design limits. The Indianapolis had life-saving equipment that was supposed to provide for crew survival if the ship was lost. Life rafts were stored in racks on the weather decks, designed to be launched by davits or simply thrown over the side where they would inflate automatically. Floater nets, large cargo nets with flotation devices attached, were stowed in accessible locations and could be thrown over the side to provide something for multiple men to cling to. Life jackets were stored throughout the ship, with every sailor assigned a jacket and trained in its use. But the speed of the sinking, the loss of power, and the severe list meant that much of this life-saving equipment could not be properly deployed. Life rafts that were supposed to be launched by mechanical davits could not be lowered because the davit systems required either electrical power or complex manual operation that was nearly impossible, with the ship listing severely and in complete darkness. Some rafts were simply thrown over the side, falling into the water where they inflated and drifted away. Others went down with the ship and floated free only after the vessel sank, by which time they were scattered across miles of ocean. The life jackets were more accessible, and many sailors grabbed them as they made their way topside. But in the chaos and darkness, not every man got a life jacket. Some sailors who had been sleeping when the torpedoes hit had grabbed for clothes and shoes, but had not thought to grab the life jackets stored near their bunks. Others found that their assigned life jacket had been moved or taken by someone else. Still others simply ran out of time. The ship was sinking so fast that they had to jump over the side without taking time to find flotation equipment. Sailors made their way to the weather decks by any route they could find. Normal passageways were blocked by damaged structures or flooding water. Vertical ladders that normally were easy to climb were nearly impossible with the ship listing so severely. What had been a vertical climb was now climbing at a steep angle, requiring hand-over-hand pulling. Some men helped others up ladders, forming human chains to pull injured or exhausted sailors up from below. Others simply found whatever route to the weather deck they could and climbed toward fresh air and the ability to jump overboard. On the weather decks, the situation was surreal and terrifying. The ship was listing so severely that walking on the deck was difficult. The starboard side, the side where the torpedoes had hit, was already awash, with water washing across the deck as the ship settled deeper and rolled further to starboard. Men gathered on the port side, which was now the high side, helping each other into life jackets, shouting for friends who were missing, trying to find officers who might know what was happening. Some men helped each other prepare to abandon ship. They checked life jacket straps, making sure they were properly secured. They tied themselves together in small groups so they would not be separated in the water. They grabbed anything that might float, empty ammunition cans, wooden gratings, pieces of debris, and threw them over the side so there would be more things to cling to in the water. These preparations were done in near total darkness, with only the light from fires on the forward part of the ship providing any illumination. The scene was chaotic, but not panicked. These were trained sailors, many of them combat veterans who had been through the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. They were frightened. Anyone would be frightened facing the prospect of jumping off a sinking ship in the middle of the night in the middle of the ocean, but they did not panic. Officers and petty officers maintained order as best they could, directing men to life rafts, helping organize groups, trying to ensure that the abandonment happened as smoothly as possible under the circumstances. Some sailors attempted to stay with the ship as long as possible, clinging to the port side as the starboard side submerged. They could feel the ship settling deeper into the water, the list increasing steadily, the bow already completely underwater with the stern beginning to rise. Those who had been through sinkings before, either in training or from experience with other ships lost in the war, urged others to get away from the ship, warning that the suction when it went down could pull swimmers under and drown them even if they had life jackets. At approximately 12:18 a.m., just 14 minutes after the torpedo strikes, the USS Indianapolis began her final plunge. The bow, already completely submerged and dragged down by the weight of flooded compartments, pulled the rest of the ship down at an increasingly steep angle. The stern rose into the air as the bow sank, creating a surreal and terrifying image in the darkness, the massive bronze propellers and rudders of the heavy cruiser rising against the night sky, water streaming off them as they were lifted from their normal environment. Men still on deck faced an impossible situation. The deck was no longer horizontal or even steeply tilted, it was becoming vertical as the ship assumed a nearly perpendicular attitude. Sailors slid down the increasingly vertical surface, unable to maintain their grip, falling toward the water or slamming into structures and equipment as they slid. Others jumped free before they could be trapped, pushing off from the ship and falling into the dark water below. In the water, swimmers desperately tried to get away from the sinking ship. They had been warned about suction, the pull of water rushing into the sinking vessel that could drag swimmers down with the ship. Some men swam with all their strength, trying to put distance between themselves and the Indianapolis before she went under. Others, weakened by injuries or exhausted from their escape from below decks, could barely swim at all and simply tried to stay afloat and hoped the suction would not be too strong. The Indianapolis made her final dive bow first, sliding beneath the dark waters of the Philippine Sea with a roar of rushing water and escaping air. She sank in approximately 12,000 feet of water, over 2 miles deep, hitting the seabed with her bow while her stern was still descending through the water column. The entire sinking, from the moment the first torpedo struck to the moment the last piece of the ship disappeared beneath the surface, took just 12 minutes. 12 minutes, less time than it takes to watch a television show, less time than a coffee break, barely enough time to cook a meal. In 12 minutes, a 10,000-ton heavy cruiser went from a functioning warship steaming toward its destination to a wreck on the seabed 2 miles down. The speed of the disaster was almost incomprehensible. There had been no time for effective damage control, no time for organized evacuation, barely time for men to reach the weather decks before the ship went under. Approximately 300 sailors went down with the ship. Some had been killed instantly in the torpedo explosions, incinerated by the blast, crushed by collapsing structures, or drowned in the immediate flooding of compartments where they were stationed. Others had been trapped in flooded compartments or had been unable to reach the weather deck before the ship sank. Still others had been on deck but were pulled down by the suction as the ship made her final dive, unable to swim strongly enough to break free from the pull of thousands of tons of water rushing to fill the void left by the sinking vessel. But approximately 900 men made it into the water alive. They were scattered across several miles of ocean, dispersed by the ship's forward motion before it sank, by the currents, and by the different times and places where men had jumped or fallen overboard. Some men were in life rafts, the fortunate few who had been able to board rafts before the ship sank or who had swum to rafts that had floated free from the sinking vessel. Others were in large groups clinging to floater nets, perhaps 50 or more men hanging onto a single net, keeping each other afloat. But most were simply floating alone or in small informal groups, wearing life jackets that kept their heads above water but provided no other protection or support. In the immediate aftermath of the sinking, survivors called out to each other in the darkness. Men shouted names of friends, asking if anyone had seen specific individuals. Officers tried to organize survivors into groups, calling out for men to swim toward voices and consolidate into larger gatherings that would be easier to spot from rescue aircraft. Petty officers took charge of small groups, providing leadership and structure in the chaos and fear. The ocean was covered with a thick layer of fuel oil that had leaked from the Indianapolis's ruptured fuel tanks. The oil, thick, black, smelling strongly of petroleum, coated everything it touched. Men swimming through the oil slick found it covering their skin, soaking into their clothing, getting in their eyes and mouths and noses. The oil caused immediate irritation, burning eyes, difficulty breathing when oil-laden water splashed into faces, nausea from the smell and from swallowing small amounts. And the oil would cause much more serious problems in the days ahead as it baked onto skin under the tropical sun, and as men inhaled droplets into their lungs. As dawn broke on July 30th, about 6 hours after the sinking, survivors could see each other for the first time and could begin to assess their situation. The sight was both encouraging and terrifying. Hundreds of men were visible, scattered across miles of ocean. This was encouraging because survivors realized they were not alone. There were many others in the same situation, and perhaps together they could survive until rescue arrived. But it was terrifying because of the sheer number of men in the water, the vast expanse of empty ocean in every direction, and the dawning realization of how difficult rescue was going to be. The survivors formed into several large groups and many smaller ones. The largest group, numbering perhaps 400 men, formed around the ship's doctor and several senior officers who provided leadership. Another group of nearly 150 men formed around the executive officer. Several smaller groups ranged from a dozen to 50 men, and scattered among these groups were individual sailors or pairs of men who had not been able to reach larger groups or who had become separated during the night. Some groups had life rafts with emergency supplies, water rations, first aid kits, flares, fishing equipment. These groups were relatively fortunate, having fresh water to ration among members and having the protection of the raft to keep them out of the water. But most groups had only floater nets or nothing at all, with men simply floating in their life jackets or clinging to debris. These men had no water, no food, no protection from sun or weather, nothing but the life jackets keeping them afloat, and the hope that rescue would come soon. The water temperature was approximately 85 degrees Fahrenheit, warm by most standards but cooler than body temperature. This meant that long-term immersion would be exhausting as bodies constantly worked to maintain core temperature against the cooling effect of the water. Hypothermia was not an immediate threat, as it would be in colder water, but the constant energy drain of maintaining body heat would exhaust men over time, making them weaker and less able to stay afloat. But the water temperature was the least of their problems. The bigger immediate threats were the sun, thirst, and the terrible realization that no one knew they were there. The Indianapolis had been unable to send a distress signal because radio equipment was destroyed in the torpedo blast before any message could be transmitted. The ship's failure to arrive at Leyte Gulf on schedule should have triggered alarms. When an expected ship does not arrive, someone should notice and investigate. But a series of organizational failures and communication breakdowns meant that no one noticed the ship was missing. The Indianapolis had been traveling alone, not part of a convoy or task force. This meant there were no escort vessels to witness the sinking and report it. The ship's scheduled arrival time at Leyte Gulf was either misunderstood or simply not being tracked carefully by whoever was responsible for monitoring ship movements. In the chaos of the final weeks of the war, with hundreds of ships moving throughout the Pacific, the Navy's tracking systems were overwhelmed and sometimes inaccurate. The Indianapolis simply fell through the cracks. Nobody realized it was missing because nobody was specifically looking for it. The survivors floating in the ocean did not know this. They expected rescue within hours or perhaps by the end of the day at the latest. They believed that when the Indianapolis failed to arrive at Leyte Gulf, someone would immediately launch a search. They expected that the Navy would send patrol aircraft to search the ship's route, that surface vessels would be dispatched to investigate, that they would be spotted and picked up quickly. This belief sustained morale through the first day. Yes, their situation was bad, but rescue was coming soon and they just had to survive until it arrived. The first day in the water was difficult but bearable for most survivors. The sun was brutal, beating down from a cloudless tropical sky on men who had no shade or protection. Most survivors had been sleeping or off duty when the torpedoes hit and had not grabbed hats or any other gear before abandoning ship. This left heads and faces completely exposed to ultraviolet radiation that quickly caused painful sunburn. Fair-skinned sailors burned most quickly, developing severe sunburn within a few hours, but even darker-skinned men eventually burned as the sun beat down hour after hour. The reflection of sun off the water surface made things worse, creating a double exposure, direct sunlight from above and reflected sunlight from below. Men's eyes, already irritated from salt water and fuel oil, became increasingly inflamed from the constant glare. Some men developed temporary blindness from the light exposure, unable to see clearly even though their eyes were not permanently damaged. This snow blindness added to the disorientation and fear, being unable to see in the middle of the ocean, dependent on others to guide them, vulnerable to any threats they could not see coming. Thirst began within hours of the sinking. The human body requires constant water intake to function properly, and physical exertion, like swimming or even just the effort of staying afloat, increases water requirements. The men in the water were surrounded by water but completely unable to drink any of it. The irony was not lost on them, dying of thirst while floating in an ocean of water, but drinking salt water would kill them faster than the thirst itself, and most men knew this and resisted the temptation, at least initially. The few life rafts that had escaped the sinking with emergency supplies had water rations, small amounts of fresh water in sealed containers that were supposed to sustain survivors until rescue arrived. But these supplies were designed for normal rescue scenarios where help would arrive within 24 to 48 hours. They were not adequate for the days that the Indianapolis survivors would spend in the water. The men in charge of rafts had to ration water carefully, allowing each man small sips at intervals, fighting the temptation to drink more and fighting the complaints of men who were desperate for water. But most survivors had no water at all. Those floating in life jackets or clinging to floater nets or debris had only the salt water of the ocean. The temptation to drink was overwhelming. Thirst is one of the most powerful biological drives, creating an almost irresistible urge to consume any available liquid. Men surrounded by water, their mouths and throats parched and swollen, fought constantly against the impulse to drink. Some managed to resist. Others, especially as the hours turned into days, eventually gave in. Drinking seawater is fatal. The high salt content, approximately 3.5% salt by weight, is far higher than the body can process safely. When seawater is consumed, the kidneys must excrete the excess salt, but doing so requires using more fresh water than was gained by drinking the salt water. The net result is further dehydration. The body loses more water trying to eliminate the salt than it gained from drinking. This creates a vicious cycle where drinking salt water increases thirst, leading to drinking more salt water, leading to further dehydration. But the immediate effect of drinking small amounts of seawater is temporary relief. The mouth and throat feel moistened. The psychological satisfaction of drinking something provides brief comfort. This makes it easy for desperate men to convince themselves that just a little seawater won't hurt, that they'll only drink a small amount. But once they start, it's difficult to stop, and the downward spiral begins. As the sun set on July 30th, the first full day in the water, survivors who had maintained discipline and not drunk seawater were exhausted, sunburned and desperately thirsty, but still relatively rational. Those who had drunk seawater were beginning to show the effects: confusion, disorientation, irrational behavior, and the approaching darkness brought new terrors that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The darkness meant men could no longer see each other, making it harder to maintain group cohesion. Voices called out in the darkness, men shouting names, calling for friends, trying to maintain contact with their groups. Leaders reminded everyone to stay together, not to drift away, to keep talking so they could locate each other by sound, but the darkness also meant they could not see what else was in the water with them. The sharks had begun arriving during the first day. The Philippine Sea in that area was populated by oceanic whitetip sharks and tiger sharks, both species known for aggressive behavior toward humans, and for opportunistically feeding on any available prey. The blood in the water from injured survivors, the thrashing of wounded men, the unusual congregation of hundreds of potential prey in one area, all of this drew sharks from miles around. Initially the sharks went for the dead, bodies of sailors killed in the torpedo blasts or who had died from injuries during the sinking floated in the water, and sharks fed on these without bothering living survivors. The men in the water could see the sharks circling, see the distinctive shapes moving through the clear water, see the feeding frenzies when sharks found bodies. This was terrifying enough, watching sharks tear apart the bodies of friends and shipmates, but at least the sharks were not attacking the living. But gradually, over the course of the first day and into the first night, the sharks became bolder. They began investigating the living survivors, circling groups of men, occasionally bumping swimmers with their snouts, testing whether these strange creatures were prey or threat. The oceanic whitetip shark is a curious and persistent predator, known for investigating anything unusual in its environment. The sharks circling the Indianapolis survivors were trying to determine what these creatures were and whether they were worth attacking. The first attacks on living men probably occurred during the first night, though in the darkness it was hard to know exactly what was happening. A man would scream, a sudden terrified sound that cut through the darkness, there would be thrashing in the water, splashing, more screams. Then silence, other men nearby would realize someone was gone, pulled under, disappeared. But in the darkness they could not see what had taken him. They could only imagine, which was almost worse than seeing. The fear spread through the groups like wildfire. Something in the water was hunting them. Something was taking men, pulling them under, killing them. In the darkness, unable to see the threat, unable to defend against it, men lived in constant terror of feeling something grab their legs from below, of being the next victim. Some men pulled their legs up, trying to stay in a tucked position to present less of a target. Others kicked constantly, hoping that movement would scare sharks away. Neither strategy was entirely effective.